Parental discretion advised on this episode of Pushback.
Go, Johnny, go, go. Go, Johnny, go, go. Go, Johnny, go, go.
If you're concerned about the direction our culture is heading, then maybe it's time to push back.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pushback. I'm Dr. Johnny, and I know the title of this podcast might be a little bit confusing. Is it indeed parental discretion advised, or is that just the title of the podcast? And I would say, I think there should always be parental discretion advised, but we're going to talk about that term. And in light of the things that are going on in this world today, and especially with the internet. So yes, parental discretion is advised, but that's also what we're going to be talking about. There have been so many things coming down the pike this week with the new Trump administration. I could have gone in 5-6 different directions for this podcast. The National Prayer Breakfast was today, and Trump said that he feels like we should bring God back into our lives. And he shared his testimony about these near assassinations that really shook him up and brought him closer to God. I believe he said something to the effect of, I've always had a belief in God, but now things have ramped up in his life in regards to his faith because of these near-death experiences. It has a tendency to do that to people. So I believe just for his own personal soul and health, that's very, very encouraging. Also, there was an executive order released to bar transgender athletes from girls and women's sports. Hooray. How many podcasts have I done specifically about that issue itself? He is recognizing two sexes, male and female, and making an executive order to bar biological men from participating in women's sports. That's a huge win for our country. It seems common sense to most of us, but to some of the population, not so much. The Indiana Department of Health was not releasing their pregnancy reports. Indiana has one of the most restrictive abortion bans of any state. And interestingly, the pregnancy abortion reports were being hidden from public view. And so there was a lawsuit. A Republican governor moved in and has now released the reports, and the lawsuit has been dropped. These are all wins that have been happening here over this week. But I want to bring up one issue that has been maybe a little bit under the radar, but I believe it's so critical to not only the health of us personally, but our children, our families, and then, of course, the country as a whole. But there's something called the Kids Online Safety Act. It's actually a bipartisan bill that was introduced, and I'm going to talk about that. But it's interesting because when we talk about parental discretion and parental guidance, something being rated PG, parental guidance, I don't even know necessarily what that means, parental guidance. Should they be guiding them to see it, guiding them not to see it? Parental discretion, I believe, is the better word. The definition of discretion is the freedom to decide what should be done in a particular situation. Well, I think that applies to parents in a very specific degree. See, the world, and especially the film industry, the television industry, is always pushing the envelope. That's always true. They're always seeing what they can get away with, what is going to be considered acceptable. And, excuse me, make no mistake about it, there is an agenda to push a certain narrative in the Hollywood arena. There's no doubt about it. There is a push toward a lifestyle that they are hoping to become acceptable. And if they continue to flood the airwaves, flood the television screen, flood the movie theaters with immoral, selfish acts of humanity, then maybe it'll become more acceptable. Amy and I like to teach a lot about common versus normal. The more things become common, the more tempted we are to call it normal. But I would submit to you the things that we are seeing on the screen, even though some of it you can consider to be quote unquote real life, most of it isn't. Most of it is a provocative, envelope pushing agenda to try to create some normalcy in aberrant behavior. That's true based on a pagan society, a godless society. If we remove God out of the equation and out of the morality of the discussion, then what we have is someone with creative license to show us what they think is normal. And that doesn't always go so great. It was interesting, this is just in my lifetime, the Motion Picture Association introduced a PG-13 rating on July 1st, 1984. And we remember that. My wife and I remember it was a response to movies like Gremlins, which I actually never saw, but Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. We all loved Indiana Jones, and he was bigger than life, and the Raiders of the Lost Ark was a provocative movie. But then the Temple of Doom came out, and it was in a series of movies that came out that year that all pushed the envelope. And the Temple of Doom was one of those that was very dark, very satanic, very graphic, and all of us, even as kids at the time, our eyebrows were raised, and our parents were outraged at what was happening. Violence and cursing and all of these things were being ramped up. And in fact, if you go back to some of these movies that were rated PG, and even some of these movies that we thought fondly of, we go back now as parents and look at them and say, they weren't so great. Back to the Future. One of my favorite movies that I thought as a child, you go back and listen, and it's filled with cursing. There's an attempted rape scene. There's violence. There's all these things that happen. You say, well, it's just a whimsical 80s movie. It's pretty rough, actually, and it would easily have been PG-13 today. But back then, it got away with a PG rating. So fast forward 30 years, and now we have full access to streaming services and non-regulated services that are doing what? Pushing the envelope. If you go into any of these other Prime Videos and HBOs and Netflix and these type of services, you have to be extremely cautious because it's not only rated R, but sometimes even beyond. And the graphic nature, the language, the sexuality that's being displayed on these shows have continued to push the envelope of decency. In response to all of this, there was a bipartisan bill that I referred to called the Kids Online Safety Act, KOSA. And interestingly, it actually passed the House. I'm reading from an article by Barbara Ortute. She's from the Associated Press. But she said the last time Congress passed a law to protect children on the internet was in 1998. That was before Facebook, before iPhones, long before today's oldest teenagers were born. Now there's a bill aiming to protect kids from the harms of social media, gaming sites, and other platforms. And it passed the Senate with overwhelming support, I believe, in 2022. Proponents of the Kids Online Safety Act include parents groups and children's advocacy organizations, as well as companies like Microsoft, X, and Snap. They say it's a necessary first step in regulating tech companies and requiring them to protect children from dangerous online content and take responsibility for the harm their platforms can cause. Opponents, however, feel that KOSA would violate the First Amendment and harm vulnerable kids who wouldn't be able to access information on LGBTQ issues or reproductive rights. Interesting. KOSA would create a, quote, duty of care, end quote, a legal term that requires companies to take reasonable steps to prevent harm for online platforms minors will likely use. They would have to prevent and mitigate harms to children, including bullying and violence, the promotion of suicide, eating disorders, substance abuse, sexual exploitation, and advertisements for illegal products, such as narcotics, tobacco, and alcohol. Social media platforms would also have to provide minors with options to protect their information, disable addictive product features, and opt out of personalized algorithmic recommendations. They would be required to limit other users from communicating with children and limit features that increase, sustain, or extend the use of the platform, such as autoplay for videos or platform rewards. In general, online platforms would have to default to the safest settings possible for accounts it believes belongs to minors. So many of the harms that young people experience online and on social media are the result of deliberate design choices that these companies make, says Josh Golan, Executive Director of Fair Play, a non-profit working to insulate children from commercialization, marketing, and harms from big tech. I think it's super interesting as we listen to this, and it passed overwhelmingly in the Senate, and interestingly, it did not come before the House. It did not gather or garner enough support on the House as of yet. And yet, it's a legislation that you would think that all people could get behind. I also found it interesting when they listed the things that they are trying to protect children from. Pornography was actually not listed there. It says sexual exploitation, but is that considered pornography, or is pornography now also considered normal? It's very interesting how some of these things slowly move in and inundate us, and the technology has grown faster than we can keep up with it. And so we look at this and we say, well, we need to have now regulations some 30 years later after a lot of harm and damage. But I want you to please hear my heart in this. I don't think it's an issue whether this bill passes or not. I think it's raising a concern that is apparent. And so I applaud our legislators for taking on something, and especially these big tech companies. But I think it's more of an issue that it's needed at all. See, I believe when we talk about parental discretion, that is what is needed. See, parents are the ones that sit on the seat of the freedom to decide what should be done in a particular situation. I don't believe we should have to move past parents. Now, legislation isn't wrong. It's not necessarily good or bad. I think it can move us in the right direction, and it can put some legal restraints on some of the envelope pushing that we're seeing in the society. I think all of that could very well be true. However, it doesn't even need to be considered if there's parental discretion and our children are being cared for and watched over. So parental discretion is advised. See, these bills move in because parents are not being proactive in discretion for their own children. We're seeing the rampant result of harm into our children's lives because we are not moving in to take our role as the ones who operate in discretion. See, no one takes a pornographic magazine and puts it on the coffee table and then tells their teenage son not to look at it. That would be cruel. And yet we hand them a cell phone, which I would argue with you with all of my heart that it's the same thing. Even more private than a coffee table. And so we do this all the time, not understanding that parental discretion is not only advised, but needed, required, essential. We are the ones that are the gatekeepers of what our children see and what they are exposed to. Now, I understand as our children get older, we don't have 100% access to every minute of their lives. And if they are seeking things that are immoral and harmful, then they probably are going to find it. I understand that. But they also have parents. We are the ones who actually were injected into their lives, who brought them life, who sows into their lives, who cares for them, tends and keeps them. And we are the ones, not legislatures, not the ones in Washington, D.C. or the state legislators that actually create the culture in which our children live. We create the culture. And so I have a simple question for you, parents. Why do your children need internet access on their phones? Why? I'm pausing for dramatic effect. I want you to think about that. What is it for? Do they need to look up sports scores? Well, let's talk about that. Guess who targets young men the most? Sports companies. It's a young men's game, typically. And so the algorithms are actually set for those that look for sports scores to actually draw them into other things that they might be interested in or to look at. Do they need it for school work? No, they can have access to the internet at school or at home on the computers in front of you in a public space. They don't need it on their private little mini computers in their hand. See, which are companies, pornographic companies, draw children in because they know the algorithms that get their attention. This is science. This is computer science. And what I am hopefully conveying to you in this podcast is that we are the ones that need to get their attention and have them put their phones down. Put their phones down. There is minuscule benefit that can come from the children accessing the internet on their own and without oversight. We don't need a legislative committee with oversight to rule and govern our children. We need parents who are proactive with oversight that rule and govern what our children are being exposed to. Do they need social media? Please. I mean, let's get serious about this. Social media is not a benefit. Whatever happened to talking to people in person and setting our phones down and having a real conversation with each other? There's something right now called the Surgeon General Media Emergency. It refers to a recent public statement by the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, declaring that the widespread use of social media among young people constitute a mental health crisis and calling for urgent action, including the implementation of warning labels on social media platforms similar to those on cigarette packs to alert users about potential harms associated with excessive social media use. Parents, we need to have our eyes opened. We need to operate in an incredible amount of discretion. We have the freedom to decide what should be done in a particular situation. Let me, on my Pushback podcast, submit to you that I believe we should set our phones down. I believe having internet access on our phones is completely unnecessary. I would actually say, is it possible to just have an emergency telephone so that they can contact each other and our parents if they need to in an emergency? And that's it. I believe that's actually the safest place for our children to sit. I believe that's operating in the greatest amount of discretion. It's constant monitoring for their well-being. Now, some people will say, well, that's helicopter parenting. That's being way too invasive. They need to be able to rule over these things on their own. And there's some degree of that. I know that parents can go too far, become controlling and obsessive. I understand that. I do believe that children need to be able to rule over these things on their own. But at age 13, at age 16, they need parents to help them govern what the things that they are seeing. I've seen over and over again how phones rule their lives. All of us go to restaurants and see families with all of them on their phones, none of them talking to each other. There's something broken socially that's taking place, but it's not irredeemable. It's completely fixable. It's by operating in discretion and understanding what the phone is for and what we're using it for. It's that simple. It's called oversight, and we're the ones in charge of oversight, not some committee in Washington, D.C. See, there are sexual boundaries that the Lord has given us, not to constrain us or to frustrate us, but for our health. And when we allow our children to operate outside of those boundaries, it hurts them. It actually makes them sick. Why would we want that for our children? Why would we want that for us? It's being proactive and operating in discretion and making right decisions. And I believe these handheld phones have not been a positive. The Surgeon General just offered an emergency for our children. He used the word emergency. We need to have our eyes open. This is not just a polite little warning that this could be destructive. This is an emergency. It needs to be conveyed. If they are exposed to the internet on their laptop or even on their phones, they need something. We use something called Covenant Eyes. These are protection programs that not only protect what the kids can see, but also report back to you what they are looking at. So I think they need Covenant Eyes or the equivalent installed on all devices at all times. That's what we do. It's not because of fear, but it's because of loving boundaries that we place around them. That's what parents do. And we need to rise up and be the ones. I applaud Washington for at least trying to move forward with something like the KOSA bill. But it's not going to be the answer. The answer are the little things that happen in our homes every single day. And we need to be aware. That's the purpose of this podcast, to create some kind of an awareness so that we know exactly what we're dealing with. Thank you for tuning in again to this podcast. I love sharing my heart on these things and digging into the things that are happening in this world. So much is happening right now. I'm going to have to spend some time sorting all of this out. It's a snowy, blustery, blowing day here in Minnesota, so I'll be spending the rest of the day on my driveway, keeping it clear from all the drifts and things. But each and every day we get to do family together, and we get to enjoy one another, the comings and the goings, the changes, the transitions. It's all a joy for his kingdom, and we play a role. I don't want to convey these podcasts with an air of darkness or concern or fear, but really a call to rise up to what we've been called to do. And I believe parents is one of the highest callings that there is. And if you're a teenager listening to this, I'm just asking you to reconsider some of the things that you're doing on social media and the time that's being spent on this little electronic device in our hand. It's not healthy. And I want you to be healthy. I want you to understand the purposes and the roles. Technology is neither good nor bad. It's just how we use it that makes the difference. And so if you're a teenager or a young person listening to this and your parents come and talk to you about it, please be open to even making some changes in your lives. It's for your benefit and it's for your good. Please go to gofam.org and see our resources, our events calendar. Things are really ramping up for our ministry, and we're doing a lot of traveling and speaking. It's been such a privilege and an honor to share our hearts with you. You can see where we are, and we'd love you to join us on some of our events that are coming up. I also encourage you to go to pushbackculture.org. You can leave a message for me about this podcast, things that you agree with, disagree with, topics that you would like to have heard in future podcasts. I would love to connect with you. And don't forget, you can connect with us and you can donate to us. This is a listener-supported podcast, and I would appreciate and value your input and donation. Thank you so much for connecting with me this week, and I look forward to connecting with you again next week. So let's go together now to set and shape the culture.